The answer to the question of where AVs fit into climate change really is up to us, how we answer it. It's what we do, it's how we look at behaviors and what we do with the technology. And I think that there's a lesson in history that's very instructive about that. At the end of the 19th century, we found ourselves with a different kind of environmental problem in our cities. We had huge amounts of horse manure piled up on the streets, in some places as high as 12 feet or 3 or 4 meters. And we saw an early effort to overcome that with an electric vehicle. But as you can see from this ad from the 1890s, we didn't guess right when we looked at that technology. It was really the internal combustion engine which took over, and it took over for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the infrastructure that we built to make it work. The potential for automation to create a carbon neutral future really depends on certain assumptions, and it starts with what level of automation we're talking about. Really briefly, there are different levels of automation, some of which are things that may be familiar with cruise control or automatic braking. But what we're really talking about here is what we call level 4 or level 5 automation, which means that there's no driver. It may be only in limited circumstances or across the board. So if we assume that these vehicles still use fossil fuels, we could either see a decline in greenhouse gases of up to 30%, or we could see an increase in VMT and then an increase in those greenhouse gases. So the declines in greenhouse gases come from more efficient driving, less time spent trying to find a parking space, just driving around and trolling for a parking space, and also increasing of platooning. Platooning is when vehicles are following each other and we're taking advantage of the aerodynamics to really dramatically reduce the amount of energy used. The vehicle miles traveled could increase both because vehicles are just driving around by themselves, but probably more importantly is that there are a number of people who don't drive now, who can't drive now, who may be driving. And we may also see increases in speed, which in fact impacts. We'll see the greatest impact, we'll see the greatest opportunities for getting to a carbon neutral future with automation if we combine it with other technologies and changed behaviors. And I like to use the concept of what I call A2 ACEs, which is accessible, automated, connected, electric, and shared. And probably the two that are the most important to combine with automation are sharing everything. And that may be technology related, or it may also be related to business models or to behaviors, but it's also converting to electric vehicles that are powered by renewable energy. Several years ago, I conducted an inventory of pilots of low-speed automation across North America and looking at some case studies in Europe and the Middle East. And at that time, we saw a number of pilots that were in progress or were just in planning. There were probably less than 5 or 6 dozen pilots that were underway at the time, and many, many more in planning. What we're seeing now, though, is kind of an interesting thing. We thought that the pandemic would really put the kibosh, would really end pilots, but instead we've seen a dramatic increase in the use of AVs for freight and the use of AVs for transit and taxis. I want to talk a little bit about the freight applications just to give a couple of examples. We've seen freight applications from long haul trucking, particularly in Texas, with trucks running from Dallas to Phoenix. But the same vehicle that's pictured in the bottom of this slide is also been deployed in Europe and in the Middle East. And we've seen it in much shorter distances, drayage in the port, middle distances like this vehicle that has been developed in cooperation with Walmart in Arkansas, and first and last mile applications. And most importantly, we're seeing electrification come to the biggest of all the vehicles in Europe and in the Middle East and in the US as well. Okay. Just like conventional transit, Most of the pilots that involved people riding in vehicles and shared vehicles stopped in 2020 as we learned how to keep people safe in shared vehicles. But what we saw was a tremendous investment in moving forward on these technologies, from shared taxis in Singapore, the fourth phase of a deployment of autonomous taxis in Texas, which include ones that are accessible with people with mobility disabilities. And then most recently, the Canadian company New Flyer has combined efforts with the state of Connecticut to put a full-size bus on the road. So each of these examples, as well as the ones that are in the corner, are fully autonomous. For the most part, they operate with a safety operator, but not because the technology requires it, but because our ongoing understanding of how these vehicles work and how we gain people's confidence in them. In both freight and transit, we're seeing vehicles that are increasingly electrified. And in this case, the New Flyer bus originally was an internal combustion engine and has just debuted an electric vehicle version. And these smaller shuttles are all electric powered. The big constraint has always been the battery charge piece of it. And as we crack the code on figuring out how to have greater battery power and longer lasting power, and also build out the charging infrastructure, they'll become more viable. One of the things that is really important in understanding how we get people to use automated vehicles is understanding a particular paradox. And that is that we are currently facing a huge increase in fatalities on the roadway at a time when people both don't trust automation, and they also know it'd be a lot safer if we had increased automation in vehicles. And there's some answers to that question. I like to talk about earning the trust of consumers, and also thinking about how we get them to cooperate when using shared strategies. So the first way is exposure. That is, if you see it, you'll probably like it. But if we wait on that, we'll never get them deployed to the level that we need to. So there are a set of strategies, including education and operating in a suitable environment, and also putting in place the kinds of safety assurance regimes that we need from the government on how we know that it's safe to operate these. One of the interesting things we've learned is that if we give a passenger the ability to stop the vehicle, they're much more comfortable and feel in control of the vehicle, even if they don't need to stop it. At the same time, we have to implement behavioral strategies, including financial incentives, to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we have even more vehicle miles traveled, not just by people in one single car, but empty vehicles. And so it's a combination of strategies to realize the full potential.